Thank you all for your patience.
Yeah, no, for sure. Thank you for being here, Apu. Good afternoon, everybody. Sorry for the delay there on the start. Thank you for coming, first off, on a Monday after Super Bowl. I heard on the way in, 17 million Americans don't show up for work today, so well done. Look at this. Look at this. And yeah, thanks again for last week. We had a lot of wonderful events, so that was great. And this is a wonderful way to kick off this week with our distinguished speaker today, Apu Kapadia, professor over at the Luddy School, associate professor of computer science, and associate director of secure computing, among rather a lot else. Does a lot of really groundbreaking, interesting work in privacy and security. Today, Apu will be talking about his paper, which he did with one of his doctoral students, Sanctioning Strategies to Maintain Social Norms and Privacy on Social Media. So thank you for being here, Apu. This is great.
Well, I had to, you know. But
well, you did.
I would have skipped today otherwise. No, I didn't actually watch the Super Bowl, but...
That's okay, you're not...
And so, yeah, this is joint work with Yasmin Rashidi, who wanted to be here today, but she fell sick. And this is like really her baby, her work, and we were celebrating her research, so I'm going to do my best. But Norman is here, wingman.
Oh, good. Good.
Tough questions, go to Norman. But okay, just briefly before I dive into these slides, which I know is typically just a quick 5-minute overview so that we can focus on the more fun discussion. The general idea behind this work was our shared interest in what's going on with these young students today as opposed to in our, good old days or old days, when we could go out, do things, not that I did anything too crazy, but none of it got recorded. But now you go somewhere and like maybe 20 cameras pop out and some of them take videos and then one of them shares it onto Twitter and life's over or whatever, right? So the previous work that Yasmin did was actually understanding how students today deal with cameras all around them. The party example is just one example. What do they do? And yes, the short answer is that they are very mindful of it. So even as one example, if someone's about to take a photo of you and one person in the frame is just holding a beer bottle, many times the person without the beer bottle doesn't even want to be in the photo, guilt by association. So this is very new for me, just thinking back to what times were like back then, maybe. Okay, so the next step, next logical step was to then think about, like, okay, we understand how people are upset with certain photos being taken and so on. And we collected various examples of that and what are the kind of workarounds to get in or out of these photos. The next question was, well, what kind of sanctioning strategies do people actually engage in? Like, how do people actually get punished, for example? Okay, so that's kind of the backdrop. But the quick introduction, and I'll skip through some of these slides because some of it is pretty obvious to this crowd, I assume. But social media has become an integral part of many people's lives, right? And these are just some statistics. 60% of Snapchat users create content every day. So, that's a huge fraction of the users that are not just have downloaded Snapchat and have forgotten about it. So it's a highly active community. 500 million Facebook stories being shared daily. Excuse me. And let's see, majority of Facebook, Snapchat, and Instagram users visit these sites daily. Again, going back to what I said earlier about not just like downloading the app and forgetting about it. And because our work has been focused on younger adults, there's a fair question of, well, what about everyone else? And that's a fair question, and hopefully we'll get there. But just of relevance is that 60% of these users of some of these platforms that we focus on are more popular with younger folks. So it kind of helps to get a read on what's going on with that population. Now, as a lot of these photos or posts are shared on social media, the interest of our group it turns to privacy. What are the privacy harms? And you can harm the privacy of other people in the photo, right? They're kind of the butt of your joke, maybe. And here I've actually just picked photos of memes, but these photos don't have to be memes. They can just be you sharing some funny photo of your own friends and that the other friend may not appreciate it. Yeah. there's so much privacy theory out there, but the one we found very relevant to this particular research problem or this question is kind of an extension of Altman's boundary regulation theory. Essentially, we form boundaries around us and are careful with what goes in and out of that membrane, that boundary. And then Petronio extends this and talks about communication privacy management. I think the important thing for us to just keep in mind is that Petronio talks a little bit more about rules that groups will come up with. So if we all get together and start articulating what's okay, what's not okay, we're actually starting to form rules of engagement, right, with the rest of the community. What stays in here? What are we allowed to kind of reveal to the rest of the world? So this is where CPM adds more nuance to previous theories. And so that connects with our work on sanctions. Like, if you're going to sanction someone, there has to be some kind of rule that you're sanctioning against. These rules may or may not be formally written down, but some could be kind of understood from a cultural perspective, norms, people just learn the norms, and some could actually be specified. Like, you go to a party, and the person hosting the party might say no cameras, and if we see a camera, you're kicked out, banned from our house or whatever for the next year. You could have rules like that. So what is a sanction? This is just one definition that we went with in our paper. So any reaction from others to the behavior of an individual or group that is meant to ensure that the person or group complies with a given norm. So if we think about these norms that exist, one argument is that norms can only exist with a corresponding sanction, right? Because if there was no sanction, then breaking the norm, what does it mean to break a norm? Breaking the norm should mean that there's some consequence. So that's kind of the connection with norms, and that's why it's interesting to study sanctions, because it sheds more light on cultural norms, as an example. So here are our specific research questions. What kinds of behaviors and content sharing do young adults identify as inappropriate on different social media? So for example, Snapchat is a very ephemeral platform. It's okay to share a little bit more kind of day-to-day, risque, whatever photos, because it's going to disappear, it's going to go to a limited audience. Facebook is kind of like a permanent record seen by a really large audience. Your parents, they're on there, your aunts and uncles are on there, and so you're kind of very careful with what you post on Facebook. Okay, so how do young adults sanction each other when someone violates these norms? And then, as computer scientists and informatics faculty and students, we're interested in the end, not just contributing to social theory, for example, but also to understand the implications for design of systems. In the end, how can we better design, add more functionality to social media, for example. I'll just move a little faster here.
Oh, you're okay.
Okay.
Great, yeah.
All right. So we interviewed 23 students on campus. They were frequent users of social media. And in short, we heard about all their different strategies, and we kind of were able to split them into 3 dimensions. 2 of these dimensions already exist from previous literature, the first 2. Where do people sanction? Is it on the site, or is it off-site, in person, or using a different platform? Use text messaging to talk to someone about what they posted on Twitter.
Yeah.
Right? Is it an individual or collaborative sanction? Is it just a one-on-one complaint, or are you now ganging up on the person? Right? Sometimes one-on-one is not enough, and you kind of band together enough support. And then, importantly, what we found from our interviews is a lot of examples of invisible sanctions versus visible. Invisible sanction is something that you do, so you feel like you've taken some corrective measure, but the person, the violator, doesn't even know that you did it, right? So for example, you might unfollow someone without unfriending them. They don't even know that. They don't know that you're not seeing their posts anymore. So you've kind of punished them in some way. I mean, you have. You've silenced them, but they don't even know it. So they're not going to learn from their mistake, at least not immediately. Okay. So in our interviews, we saw various examples. I could spend a lot of time on this slide, but I actually feel like the categories on the left many times are quite self-explanatory. So I'll quickly go through them, right? So you can confront someone a little bit more directly. The more indirect one, the invisible example I gave is you could gossip and complain. When you kind of feel powerless, what can you do? You just talk to many people about it. You know, it's a different way of maybe eventually causing damage to the person, but at least immediately the person doesn't even know you're gossiping about them. But you also get kind of affirmation from others. When people sympathize with you, you kind of, maybe it relaxes you more, gives you more perspective, helps you move on. You could just, of course, let it go. A lot of people will do that. Why cause problems? Like, you know, just let it go. Excuse me. But you could also kind of be passive aggressive in a way, right? If somebody posts something to Facebook and they typically expect to get some number of likes, you know, I posted my kitten's photo or my kid's photo, and usually you expect 100 likes, but somehow you only got 5. Now that's maybe a signal that, you know, in general people didn't like what you do. So that gave you kind of a more aggregate style example. But this can happen at an individual level, what we saw. Like, you know, your uncle posts something and you responded to the friend who had the opposite view, right? And you didn't respond to your uncle's post at all. So that's kind of a very clear signal if the uncle's following and reading along with how you're responding that you were ignored. What else? Yeah, and I talked about, you know, ganging up on people, but sometimes this can be uncoordinated, sometimes it could be actually coordinated, but you're actually talking to people, organizing, and let's all kind of respond to this one person. Or it could just be general community agreement that this post is not okay, and everyone just, you feel like you're being ganged up on. So in general, I feel like there's a lot of discussion we could have here, or in general we need to have. Which is, well, how do we support sanctioning, and what are the implications of supporting sanctioning on social media? I talked about this invisible versus visible, right? So people prefer to be more discreet. I think this is maybe obvious because we have social relationships at stake. We don't want to burn bridges. You know, there's a lot of diplomacy involved. But at the same time, so whatever designs we suggest, right? Let's say we have a way of sanctioning people on Facebook. Click this button. You can report people and so on. But I think a very important discussion does need to be had, which is, well, you can't have a completely normative society, and that might actually be bad. You actually want to support dissent and anti-normative behavior. So we're not actually advocating that we need to provide controls to force people to be normative. What we are trying to say, though, is that we need to improve transparency. It would be nice if people knew that they were violating a norm. Some people know that they are kind of pushing the boundaries and trying to change, and maybe you don't need to change anything for them. But what about people who don't know they're violating a norm, and maybe this hurts them, and they didn't even mean to do, you know, to offend people? Or maybe you intentionally do want to violate a norm and move the community in a certain direction. Well, it might be nice to understand how much traction you're getting by getting some kind of feedback. How many people kind of are supporting your message and how many aren't? And so our paper has a discussion about these 4 particular topics. So let's see. So there was, you know, this direct versus indirect feedback. So it's kind of scary people to directly confront someone. Instead, there might be a more diplomatic, indirect way of kind of expressing that you didn't like what they posted. Some of you might be familiar with text messaging, or if you have these Apple Watches, I just remember there were some canned responses, right? You could just click on something and it's written for you. Maybe some kind of canned responses could help people overcome that barrier, be able to signal something more polite. But maybe that's still too scary because the person on the other end knows it came from you. So what if you could support anonymous mechanisms of providing feedback? I posted something on Facebook. People are too scared to say anything, but then I get this report at the end of the week that says, actually 60% of the people who read this did not like it. I'm not going to tell you who, but did not like it. Now, of course, there are implications to this, psychological implications. You know, now, I mean, there's a reason why Facebook doesn't have a dislike button, you know, to keep things happy. You know, you don't want to hear that your friends don't like thumbs down to what you're posting. So I think there's room for discussion and research on this side of things. Let's see, what else did I want to say here? Making support visible to sanction privacy violations. So, for example, let's say you posted something, ignoring whether it's right or wrong, you posted something and you got a lot of pushback, not a lot, you got pushback from some couple of members of the community, right? And now you're feeling terrible about yourself, and everybody else is scared to say anything and just wants to let it go, like why cause any harm? But unfortunately, you know, are now this victim, right? There might be some kind of, you might have talked about something that carries social stigma. And it would be nice if people could click on, say, a button that says, I support you, you know, like you have supporters. And maybe you just get a count, you know, you have like 75 supporters, but we don't want to say anything, but we're with you, kind of thing. So I feel like there's opportunity for designs like this and don't exist yet. And let's see. And then we have a discussion more on the computer sciencey end. You can actually have tools that do machine learning that try to actually automatically learn what are the norms of your particular community. And there have been researchers doing this. And when you're about to post something, the algorithm can tell you, this does not doesn't appear to be normative. Do you mean to do it? It's okay if you mean to do it, but do you mean to do it? Or, hey, you've been posting 2 standard deviations more than the average person on this group. People might think you're annoying. I mean, you have to convey that in a nice way. But you know, if you could give automated feedback like that, then the person getting the feedback knows that this is not coming from some other human. So maybe you're psychologically less affected because you know that no particular person is pointing fingers at you. It's just an algorithm, you know. And now, of course, algorithms can be wrong and all that. That's why you don't let the algorithm make a decision for the system, but you kind of highlight to the person to reconsider. So actually, I'll stop there and we can move on to the paper discussion. But yeah, thank you.
It was very helpful. Yeah, thank you so much.
All right.
Cool. Great. Well, the floor is open. I can start keeping the cue here. While
yeah,
people are thinking.
What's the general format here? I mean, I'm going to open up my laptop and take all kinds of notes because your feedback will help us.
Yeah, no.
But just let me know if I'm supposed to be doing something that I'm not.
Yeah, well, you can respond to definitely questions. There might be a couple of just kind of general comments, but you're fine too. And then we usually do like kind of a wrap up at the last minute or two. So,
all right.
While people are thinking, I can maybe get us started, and then yep, Angie and Julie. In fact, Angie, if you want to just kick us off, that's fine. I can insert myself.
Yeah, I'm curious. Since you used some common social networking platforms, do you have an idea, or I think there's research out there, I don't know the answer off the top of my head, of how many people are actually as interactive as you're asking them to be?
Could you say the last sentence again?
Well,
I don't catch.
my experience on Facebook is that I have a couple friends who post tons of pictures about their kids.
Mm-hmm.
But most of us don't like 2/3 of that.
Yeah.
So tons of users of Facebook and similar sites are basically scrolling through as trolls. They're not as interactive as what you seem to suggest you're asking people to be. So I wonder how you account for the vast majority of individuals on these doing nothing but gathering detail and versus being as interactive as what it seems like you're suggesting people are.
No, I think this is a good point. I feel like, we know that people are active, but I think you raised a good point that, well, they may not be interactive. They might be active. They're going on there, they're reading stuff. They might post something, but how are they actually engaging with
I didn't like your Facebook post today that you're speaking here. It didn't mean I wasn't looking forward to it and enjoying it.
Right.
And I definitely wouldn't.
You were an angry face in the front.
You know what I mean? So I wonder, I mean, to me, there has to be a caveat at the beginning of this that says, hey, look, of the people who elect to be incredibly active on Facebook, but they're also terrifying because it means they're the freaky people who are creating norms that I reject.
Yeah.
So, you know, I think there's an argument to be made that you're overgeneralizing the behavior of these particular platforms from everything from WeChat to Instagram, which I refuse to be involved in, because I really don't want pictures of food, you know, to Facebook. And I think the vast majority of people are information gatherers on these sites, not interactive. I don't think my friends need me liking it to know I enjoy pictures of Scott and his children. You know, of course I do. They're cute, they're nice, they have a good time. I don't need to like it.
Yeah, no, that's a good point.
You know, but that's the norm, right? Because that is really common of how people behave on Facebook. So that means that norm is never captured.
Yeah.
Sorry,
Norman.
No, if I can just interject, I think that's a totally valid point. I think the behavior does, the people that Yasmin talked to, all the behavior depends on the social ties with the content that they're talking about. So for example, maybe, you know, you don't like Apu's talk because maybe, you know, I don't know, how close you two are together. You're not that close together, probably, maybe. But if you're talking about a close family member or something, maybe you're more likely to like or engage with that content, or even think about sanctioning something that affects something with your social ties. So I'd say there is that interaction effect with the social ties. That is content, you know, some aspect on it. But you're right, there is a lot of content that people don't care about, and they're just scrolling their news feed.
Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
No, I was going to say it could also be, again, this young adult population that really are attuned, not attuned, but they feel the obligation to like stuff, because if you don't like things, then people are going to get offended. Like, why didn't you like my
that's what that was part of what I wondered as well, is if there's, you know, I'm the first to admit that I use Facebook differently than my students, I would assume.
Me too, me too.
I know I do. So I wonder how much of that is you know, not captured as well.
Yeah.
It seems like you want to differentiate on user traits and maybe even age groups, but also I wonder how much of it is platform specific.
Right.
Because even some of the background norms that are operating like on LinkedIn versus Facebook, and the types of stuff that gets posted, and how likely you are to like something about a new job, whatever it might be. I don't know, some of that might be worth sussing out a bit more too, but we can come back to that. So far I have Julie and Jess. We'll go around. Oh, did you have like a two finger? Oh no.
I've been a two finger, but you answered it. So.
Oh no. Oh, okay. I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah.
Hi. Super interesting paper presentation.
Thank you.
I have a few very simple questions. My first question is, how representative are college students of all social media users? Because the paper starts by saying social media users in general, and then the data is from college, interview with college students. And then second is the degree of caution, exercising caution. Does it depend on the degree of connectivity or the size of the network of the individual users? So, like, could it be that if some users, if they don't have a big connection, does it mean that they exercise less caution, or they behave differently when they put out comments and stuff? And then my third question is, how different do you think are these online social media interactions versus real world interactions? When, for example, when we're put in a room together, do you think, so I guess my point is a matter of authenticity, when maybe a difference in authenticity or spontaneity when regarding the contents of comments people put out, and so do you think these differences matter?
Yeah, I can take a crack at some of these, and then Norman will rescue the day. Okay. Well, the first one is an absolutely fair question about the sample. So I think we're not necessarily going to don't want to defend our choice of college students. For now, it's kind of like it is what it is. We're interested in this question. We were interested in this question for the younger population, but college students don't represent all of the younger population. So that's definitely true, but it was just a practical first step to see how our young college students, undergrads in particular, dealing with this. And the reason why we made that choice, and correct me if I'm wrong, Norman, is that we felt like they're just coming out of high school typically and now have this independence, but at the same time, as they get closer to graduation, they really start worrying about their image and, when it comes to being employed and so on. So we felt that even though it was a narrower focus, we would get stories about people just coming into college life and maybe not caring a lot, and then some people caring a whole lot. And so that was kind of the practical, but also kind of interesting angle on that particular population. But I think, yeah, we have to be careful and definitely convey to people that this does not generalize. It's really just learning different themes. And then the design suggestions, though, might just still make sense, even though we're not necessarily capturing how people sanction and what people feel is okay on one platform versus another. The design suggestions still might seem, reasonable. I mean, these are just arguments, but in general, yeah, it's whatever. 23 Bloomington undergrads, right, for whatever it's worth, and we have a lot more work to do. Yeah. Let's see. Did you want to add anything to that, Norman? Okay. And then I think Norman talked about this just a few minutes ago. The different kinds of caution people have based on network size and connectivity. So we did hear a lot in the interviews about close relationships versus distant relationships, the strong ties versus weak ties, and people were more mindful of that. In some cases, they were more comfortable talking to strong ties and care about their privacy. Like, hey, you should really take this off. This doesn't look good for you. They were more likely to do that, for example. Whereas if it was someone else, it's like whatever, their problem, right? So that was for certain kinds of problems. But for other kinds of problems where what the example I gave was where I'm concerned about your privacy, and since you're somebody I care about more, I talk to you. But on the other hand, if you violated my privacy, what I remember is that then you were kind of very scared about that relationship, and you wanted to be very careful because this is a close friend. I don't want to lose a friendship over this. Whereas with a weak tie, it was just easy to unfriend, unblock. The consequences of unfriending a weak tie are pretty low, right? Compared to someone you know better. So yeah, definitely got a lot of stories related to the strength of the relationship. But you brought up network size, and I don't believe we got anything about that, because I think that also would make a big difference, right? How many people are going to be witnessing? Like, I mean, people did say things like, I don't want to make a fuss about this on social media, but I think there's a more general statement that it's public. I don't want to make a public deal out of this.
When you talk about the category of like, oh, I have a lot of people from my work also in my networks.
I see, yeah.
But I think, yeah, network size would have been I think that's a good suggestion that we should be asking that question.
I mean, they talked about Snapchat versus Facebook. So in that sense, they talked about, in Snapchat, not only is it ephemeral, but it is to a smaller group, and hence not such a big deal. Whereas on Facebook, it's a large group and stays there. So there are two things mixed in, but people did talk about about network size in that regard. Did you want to add something to that? Did you? Yeah. I mean, I was going to answer one more question, but if
did you have like an interjection you wanted to?
Oh no,
just
was trying to
get on the queue. You got it. Absolutely. Yep.
And then I don't know. The third one was online versus real world interactions. So I think now, if anybody knows about the literature on this, should jump in, because now this is just my opinion, because we didn't look into.
I think the first paper, the Japanese first paper, talks about that a bit, right? How people's interactions change.
Maybe if you remember that, you could jump in.
Well, Yasmin's first paper was really about how people often think about the life cycle of photos. So when people are in a party or a physical scene, they are thinking about, once this photo is taken, what is its journey going to be? Is it going to go off to be posted on social media? It's going to be, my friends are going to share it, and so they think about where they can stop the photo from being distributed. So because they're always thinking these things, always thinking about, I think it does change notions of what is authentic behavior and not, and what kind of authenticity do you want to portray to the rest of the world, right? Because if I'm going to be on job market, the solo cups always come up. I think that's a popular example, right? The red cups, it signifies partying and things like that, and so they want to avoid that. And so, yeah, I mean, there's a lot of bigger issue questions about what's a word of, we are being surveilled all the time in some aspect, right? And we have to worry about that all the time. And college students are very good about thinking about that, actually, I would say. Yeah.
Great questions. So, yes, please. So we have and then
Awesome. All right.
So I have kind of a couple of questions. One is around like power in some of these relationships, and the second one is around like kind of like third party sanctions. And I guess the one with the power, I know you mentioned that you looked at these like stories or incidents that the students volunteered with a peer or family member. And when I was thinking about that, I was curious if it was different, because I know you mentioned like close distance, strong, weak, but if anything came up about whether being in like a position of power with a family member, for instance, so perhaps like a parent or someone posts something on your behalf and you might be less likely to engage in some sanctions with that person because maybe they're paying your college tuition or some other thing. So I'm kind of curious if that ever came up about like kind of like whether someone was a peer or in a position of power. And then I feel like some of the sanctions examples were focused on like if you were the one that felt like slighted or had like that breach of privacy. And I was curious if anyone ever volunteered engaging in that conversation as just two witnesses. And the example I give, I think a lot of my generation are currently parents, and so there's this debate about whether you should be posting photos of your child at what age, with or without their consent. So I've been privy to conversations like, oh, can you believe so-and-so posted this photo of their child throwing a tantrum, and like, is that okay? But like that person who did the action was never there, and yet we're talking about these like, kind of like policing these sanctions. So I'm curious if those kind of stories ever came up too.
Yeah. So I'll talk about what I remember. So I remember being very interested in this power question. Well, as a group, we were all interested in this power question, but I don't think this paper and this set of interviews got much traction there. Norman, am I right? Yeah. I mean, we don't have many power examples. It was focusing more on kind of peer relationships. I think not everything from the interviews made it into the paper, and Yasmin might have had some good examples that she would remember having conducted all the interviews.
There are some power aspects about, like, there's a lot of power with the person that's holding the camera, for example, and taking the picture. So how do you, are you allowed to stop them, and the people that are in the picture are powerless to stop it, right? Because, you can't always just grab the phone and physically stop them from taking the picture. So I think there's interesting, from a systems perspective, for example, where do you police it? And who has the power to stop a photo and things.
Oh, this paper does also talk about one particular example where this one person, in this case, the power position is kind of what Norman said. As the owner of the photo, you have that power where people, even though the person in the photo is being portrayed in a negative light, they're powerless in some sense to get this photo taken down. Like, it's hard to complain to the platform, like, oh, this person has a photo of me, take it down. It's like, oh, it's so hard to do that. And so really the person who has taken the photo is like empowered with this decision. Like, they can just, in some sense, depending on the content, ruin people's lives, to some degree. And you really have to beg them. And in this case, I feel like the example was, maybe there was one example where it didn't work and another example where they got enough people ganging up and telling this person to take it down, where the person eventually took it down. So I think that's the most concrete example, but not in terms of power structures that pre-exist, like you said, like a parent or a boss or just somebody with more social capital, where you would be too scared to go against them. I don't think we have too many examples.
Study.
Second?
Will come out in her next study.
Next study. Oh yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Always good call.
Yeah, I have a question more about the privacy aspect of
We're right over here next. I'm sorry, but we will get to you. I promise.
No problem. Go ahead.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Feel free. Yeah.
Did you find that members of the peer groups had different definitions of privacy? And the reason for that question, of course, is sanctioning depends on like how someone perceives privacy, right? And I found in my own experience that we view I view privacy differently than another friend of mine, you know, for instance. So I could say asking for a friend, but I made this mistake. I was doing an ethnographic presentation at my school here on the other side of campus, and took a picture from Facebook that was related to my presentation, and it was of a colleague in my class. And my assumption was that if it's on Facebook, like it's public knowledge, like it's out there. Her assumption, she was so upset. She's like, that was embarrassing. That was a private photo, and I was like, and she unfriended me on Facebook actually. But we had different definitions of privacy at work, different understandings, and I wonder if that popped up in your research.
Yeah. We learned some. Well, let me see. Okay, so people did talk about privacy in a way that we didn't expect sometimes. So, for example, people said that they really felt it was a privacy intrusion when they looked at their newsfeed and had to read all this stuff they didn't agree with, right? And this doesn't have to be like informational privacy. My information was leaked, like in your example. Just this person is talking about politics, about the person I don't like, and doing a little bit too much. And even though you have the right to say whatever you want, but my news feed feels like my personal space, just like your home or whatever. And I feel like this is an intrusion. And other privacy scholars have recognized intrusions as a privacy problem. So that was one example of notions of privacy that people brought up during the talk. I mean, not talk, during the interviews. But let's see, so your example, I mean, people talked about, I don't know if we have examples of this discord between one definition versus another. I think we just reported on the general consensus of what's okay on Facebook, what's okay on Snapchat, what's okay on Twitter. One interesting thing I remember is that Facebook seemed to be treated as public. Like everyone's on Facebook, doesn't matter, you know. But if you post something on Facebook, it better be something that's okay for public consumption. So you're very careful. You pick Facebook for that. You pick Snapchat, like I said, for more private stuff. It's going to disappear. But the thing that was surprising to me is that they treated, at least some of the participants treated Twitter as being more private than Facebook, which to me is the opposite. Because to me, Twitter is the world. But to them, it could be that Twitter is where their parents are not yet. So they don't really care about the world. They care about this like family, you know, the family group maybe, you know, like if your family is not there, then all of a sudden it feels more private. So that was something interesting, but not necessarily kind of people disagreeing. And your example is a good one, where you didn't, like your version of the norms is different from the other person's version, how they view what's okay and not okay on Facebook. I don't know if it was an age thing or a cultural thing, I mean, but it's interesting, yeah.
Can I go to, oh, sorry.
Oh, did you have a
Sorry,
quick
sorry.
one, Gustavo, or to interject?
No,
there?
please go.
Okay, well, I'll get you on the list though, yeah, please.
I have a more basic question, I think, maybe a bit provocative. To what extent the very need to have better tools to regulate the norms in the internet are generation specific? In a sense that it is part of our concerns, our generation concerns, what internet did to the society, and not necessarily the younger generation concerns. Was it part of your work and part of the research also? Did you try to understand that?
I guess we didn't try to directly ask them, do you think such tools are needed and what's missing? What we tried to do was kind of indirectly get at this to see where is technology failing, because they are applying these sanctions. They are coming in the previous paper, they are engaging in all kinds of workarounds. And all these examples highlight the faults or the lack of adequate mechanisms with social media. So although I can't directly answer how much they actually want these things, our research at least shows that they are trying to do all of these different sanctions and workarounds, but the platforms are not supporting what they're trying to do, so then they have to go engage in offline diplomacy and all these different approaches. Whereas our design suggestions at least try to move in a direction that says that, you know, all these behaviors we're seeing will be made much smoother if you improve the systems in that way.
Interesting to actually design a system like that and see what the experience is, you know?
Yeah.
Since we probably won't convince Mark anytime soon.
Yeah.
Yes, please.
With those, we were discussing that they were having like informal or formal tools actually implying sanctions. Did they actually discuss any use of the formal tools themselves and the scenarios with it? Because I know like some people have Facebook, for example, will have like snooze or sleep or something.
Right.
You won't see people, and that's different than completely blocking or unfriending.
Yeah, people talked a lot about that actually, at least the one example you gave. I don't know if they use the word snooze, but they use the word muting or unfollowing, and they specifically said that, you know, when you unfriend someone, they know it, or they could know it pretty easily, and that's very dangerous for your social relationship. Maybe it could damage it. So they really seem to like the unfollow or mute feature, because again, this was that invisible action, you know, kind of maintaining the peace. And so they talked quite a bit about using that form of sanction. So it maybe, so that points to like, oh, okay, if there's an actual button I can click on and it does what I want, I would use it. Maybe that's evidence that, you know, if we just had other mechanisms that made sense and maintained their privacy and their social ties, then maybe you can have the best of both worlds, and then they would use it.
Yes,
Thank you.
please.
So since you, in your flyers, since you recruited self-proclaimed active Facebook, active social media users only, I'm wondering whether the strategies that you described might be specific to those who have greater knowledge about the tools available, such as unfollowing someone or muting someone, whereas for those users who may not be as active on social media, they might employ different strategies, maybe more confrontational or less confrontational.
I think that's a great point. Be worth looking at. Yeah, so you're right. I think we do look at active users, and there are people who don't even know certain features exist, and maybe they have higher dropout rates, and like you said, they might engage in some of these other offline strategies more. I think that's very interesting.
And even some questions about awareness of basic privacy settings could be, you know, pretty interesting to see, like, how do you unfollow? Or Facebook just changed their like third-party notifications, but last week, so you can see who's following your, you know, Facebook feed. Cool. Cool. Gustavo, then Tony.
But actually, I'll add one more thing.
Oh yeah, please.
Based on what you just said. So, so there's this privacy paradox paper, the control paradox, that shows, at least seems to show, that when people feel like they have more control, they take more risks. This generalizes more to the risk literature, which I'm less familiar with. I think Gene Kemp is an expert on that. But basically, if you know you have more control, maybe that makes you feel more comfortable, and maybe that's why you end up sharing more. So there's this paradoxical result that if you know about these different items, you might take more risks, whatever that means. And for sanctioning, I'm not sure what that means yet, but at least for information sharing with privacy controls, adding privacy controls and creating more awareness of it, it's not clear if that works as intended.
Yeah, that is interesting. Hussein.
So I think connected with her point, it's so the traditional literature on norms and sanction is, the norm is pretty clear, and then you try to figure out how to enforce that norm, no? But here it looks like the scenario is a little bit different. The norm is pretty diffuse, no? Different people have different views of what is a violation of the norm. So in some sense, the norm and the means of enforcing the norm are co-evoluting. So they are kind of being redefined constantly. That puts you in a very kind of in a different environment, because it's not clear to me what are you enforcing if the norm is not a shared vision of what is accepted as not accepted. Okay, So that's one thing to, I don't know, it's kind of an open question. I'm not sure if there is an answer. So that's one thing. And then in the traditional literature on enforcing whatever norm, there always some role for enforcers, no? So, which again, are some people playing these roles as enforcers? Like, I don't know, if I get a sanction from one particular, powerful person or whatever, crucial in the network is different from getting all these anonymous sanctions. And the third thing is when you are enforcing rules, there is a whole discussion on fairness or the level of the sanction, if it's appropriate given the violation of the norm, no? So essentially there is also some kind of view of the rest of the people of what kind of sanction I'm going to apply, no? And then I think that's, I know there are some lawyers in the room, there is also some idea in the penal codes that then depending on what kind of violation is the type of sanction that you get. So I'm sure that there are also people very careful about what kind of sanction they apply, depending on how they perceive the intensity of the violation of the norm. But in a situation in which this is very diffuse, they don't really know exactly what is the norm. No? Again, some very open thoughts. I don't know if
those are great thoughts. Yeah, so I think maybe. And some of you might be more, might be experts on norms and society. So please jump in. But my sense is that online you have so many groups coming together, and the groups are so much more dynamic, just because it's so easy for people to join and leave, that it's really community specific. Norms are community specific, perhaps in general, but like I said, online these groups can form, so easily. And it's like you have to learn what's okay in this particular group versus that particular group, and you have to really learn this quickly. And so maybe we do need, this is more of a case for the need to have transparency and tools to quickly learn what's okay, not okay in this group, and then to shape it.
Oh yeah,
well, related, because it sounds like one of the things is that these norms might be specific to different platforms, but one of the things that's difficult is it seems like it's also the case that some of these that individuals interact with these platforms in different ways, which is to say, for instance, specifically with respect to strong and weak ties, right? And so if you're strong, so one of the things that's interesting to me, right, is that Facebook has people of strong and weak ties on it, and there seems to be a general emerging norm that it's generally somewhat public. There's also this problem of these spaces that seem to have primarily strong ties on them, and yet those are places where there are lots of things you still wouldn't want to share. And particularly, you might be more interested in sharing or willing to share with a broader, more diffuse group of weak tie contacts, because they're A, unable to sanction you with the same level of force, and also you don't care if people you don't know that well know all sorts of things about you, but you do care if the people you know really well.
Oh yeah.
And so I'm trying to think about this question not only of how the norms might be community specific, but even the determining of what the norms are in that community might depend on the distribution of your strong and weak ties across these platforms.
Yeah, and I think I like your example of with strong ties, you may not. There's certain things you actually don't want to share, typically things that are associated with stigma. If you're dealing with mental health issues, you might want to talk to. It could be a group of anonymous people on the internet. You might know their name, but you don't really know them, and you might be much more comfortable sharing your experiences with them, or have some kind of support group. And you might want to deliberately keep certain topics away from your family.
Well,
so yeah, that
leads to the next question, because at some point you had said earlier, like, oh, well, so much of our conclusions depend on whether we're talking about strong or weak ties. But I was sort of thinking it'd be really interesting to try to flesh that out in a more systematic way.
Yeah.
Think about which relationships that you are speaking to in terms of the way people think about and enforce norms across these platforms. Like, what are the ways, could we develop a set of sort of like systematic understanding as to the ways in which they rely on particularly the distribution of strong and weak ties across these platforms for each individual. That would be, I would, personally, I would think that'd be really, really interesting, but I don't know if that's a direction.
No, it is interesting. In fact, on another project, we looked at this in the context of ROTC students on campus again here. They are transitioning, they're transitioning into college culture also, so on all those associated problems of just transitioning. And then they're also transitioning into military culture. And so they're going through various crises. And so our focus there was how do you deal with crises? And who do they share their crises with? And it was very interesting. There's certain things you absolutely keep away from your fellow ROTC students. Any sign of weakness or injury, you hide it because you're being peer evaluated, and if you don't seem strong enough, then you get negative peer evaluations, and then these evaluations play a role. It's not the only thing, but they play a role in some kind of rank order listing at the end of when it comes to graduation and getting the job you want. So if you want to become, I'm just coming up with this example, Air Force pilot, you better be in this band. So they are really concerned about that list at the end, and so they hide certain things from even their closest. Well, it's not a general statement, but for example, we heard many stories about how they would hide all this stuff from their close ROTC friends. But then, of course, they would share many of these things with family. So yeah, we do find this interesting and are seeing examples of very, in that case, we call it hyper-selective disclosure, but there was so much at stake that they were very careful.
When sanctioning hurts a lot more in those communities, right?
Yeah.
Than it does in an anonymous one. And so the cost of sanctioning is higher to both parties, which is, I think, kind of interesting.
Yeah.
Just to add to the discussion about the fluidity of community, I think the earlier question, I feel like it's something we struggle with too. So for example, is there a Facebook community? I think it is apparent that there is a perception, for example, that Facebook is now quite public, and it's evolved into that. So Facebook has tried different measures like Facebook pages and Facebook groups to create a sense of community, and then they have their own moderators and enforcement there. And maybe there the norms are more rigid in some sense, but there's a lot of spillover right into your general faces. So it's a challenge to say like what is a Facebook community, but I feel like my guess is like originally Facebook was much more close knit, and maybe you would have different community norms, but nowadays it has changed, and that's why people seek other places like Snapchat and other media to get that. So I think it's not a clear answer what is meant by who are the enforcers of Facebook at large. That's a tricky question, I think.
And just to help wrap us up here, Tony, we'll do a quick lightning round here. Yep, Tony, and then yep.
So I really liked the paper. I liked there was a lot about it that I liked, although I thought there was kind of conceptually and analytically, I thought it got a little muddled with this idea of rules, norms, and strategies, and that's something that Crawford and Ostrom unpack. And one of the things really kind of hinges on your paper is this idea of sanctions, where rules have a formal or else statement in them, whereas norms don't. But you sometimes talk about things as being rules in here, but in fact they're just kind of norms. And you're talking about sanctioning, and sometimes it comes off as like this enforcement official, there's an exact rule behind it. So I just thought that those institutional statements could give you some leverage. Especially, and then the other part was, and I really like kind of the conversation about it being norms or actual shared strategies, although you do talk about some behaviors being illegal sometimes, which would be more of a rule, right? And then the other part, you have 23 interviews of people who either kind of did something that deserved sanctions, or witnessed a sanction, or sanctioned others. I was wondering if any of this sanctioning actually changed behavior at all. And if so, then that could be kind of cool. Like, the community can kind of police its own behavior. But if none of the 23 actually had any sort of behavior change, I guess that was one of the things that I thought would make the conclusion a little bit stronger. Those would be a couple of the things.
Cool. So maybe we'll take the last one, and you can respond to both if you'd like to. Yeah.
Do any of the students that you surveyed or other people have multiple accounts for different subject areas like somebody really likes to post about food and they have like their food account and then the rest of their life is something else.
I believe so. I mean, we didn't go into that in too much depth. They had multiple social media accounts, but you're talking based on topics, right?
Right, so like on Instagram, for example,
Right.
where they have their general one and then something specific that might be more anonymous or, you know, more limited network.
I think this came up, and Yasmin talked about these, like people have two types of Instagram accounts, but we didn't go deep into that. So I think the short answer is yes, but we didn't investigate it in a deep way.
And did you have any response to, yeah, or even just general comments as we wrap up here?
Yeah, so the behavior change, I mean, we saw spot examples of changing people's decisions and like they decided to take the post off and so on. But we don't know if we had whether these sanctions actually had a lasting behavioral change. Like, yeah, we were able to change that one decision, that one photo that they posted, but did they do that begrudgingly? And next time they'll know better and do it anyway, or did they actually change? And that's a really good question that I think would be worth studying, which is, do these sanctions, we're saying that sanctions, and other people have said it, sanctions help people learn what the norms are, and we got examples of various sanctions with norm violations, but then did it actually help people learn and change the way they behave? That's a great question.
You have to come back and tell us what you.
Yeah, more on that next year, I don't know.
That's right. And I'll send you guys just a couple of links to kind of couch this in the workshop literature if you're interested. Like there's some stuff around boundary conditions and graduated sanctions that are baked into the design principles. Yeah. And there's this whole like governing knowledge commons framework, and there's a privacy edited volume coming out on that. So some of that could be applicable. So I'll send some thoughts to you. But how about a round of applause for Apu? The whole team there, that was great. I have to say well done to Yasmin too. Great discussion. I thought that was really well done, guys. Remember, Wednesday we're kicking off the research series for the term, which is going to be a lot of fun with Jane. And then next Monday we have Carrie from O'Neill. And look forward to seeing you there, if not before. So thanks again. Enjoy the beautiful afternoon and watch Iowa tonight.
And thank you.
Next Monday after the colloquium, we are having this meeting because we are proposing some changes to the value program. And we figured out that the best option is that when you are coming here for the colloquium, so immediately after the colloquium, if you want to stay for a little bit longer, I will be presenting some of the proposed changes. I'm happy to hear back feedback, questions.
We could even maybe get some food in too for people who want to stay to make sure. Yeah, we'll talk about that.
Yeah, thank you all for coming and your comments. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
And for reading the paper.
Wow. Yeah, no,
It's actually one of the, it's a very